Help me! Please! Somebody help me! The desperate cry echoed through the narrow alley, cutting through the usual din of Zarathia's spaceport. Theo froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned towards the sound, instinct urging him to investigate. As he approached, he saw a figure huddled against the wall, trembling with fear. It was a girl, but unlike anyone he had ever seen. Her white hair cascaded over her shoulders. Her skin shimmered with a jade-green hue. Bat-like ears protruded from her head, twitching nervously, and her tattered leather clothing clung to her curvaceous form. She looked up at him with wide, pleading eyes, a mix of desperation and hope. Theo's breath caught in his throat. He had heard stories of alien races from the outer rims, beings of unearthly beauty and strange customs, but seeing one here, in the underbelly of Zarathia, felt surreal. She was no hologram, no trick of the light. She was real, and she was in trouble. "Hey," he said softly, crouching down to her level, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you okay?" She flinched at the sound, her ears flattening against her head. For a moment, he thought she might bolt, but then she spoke, her voice melodic yet raw with desperation. "Please, help me!" The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He glanced around, scanning the alley for signs of danger. The spaceport was a hive of activity, but this corner felt eerily still, as if the shadows themselves were holding their breath. "What happened to you?" he asked, keeping his tone gentle. "Why are you here?" I escaped," she said, her words halting as she struggled to catch her breath. "They were going to sell me." Theo's jaw tightened. Slavery was outlawed in Zarathia, at least on paper, but everyone knew the syndicate operated beyond the reach of the law. They trafficked in everything: spice, weapons, people, and they didn't care who got caught in their web. "Who's after you?" he pressed, though he already suspected the answer. "The syndicate," she whispered, her eyes darting to the alley's entrance. "They'll find me soon. They always do." He cursed under his breath. The syndicate wasn't just a gang. They were a force of nature, a storm that swept through lives and left nothing but wreckage behind. Getting involved meant painting a target on his back, and Theo had spent years keeping his head down, surviving by staying out of their way. But as he looked at her, those pleading eyes, that fragile strength, he knew he couldn't walk away. Not this time. "Come with me," he said, extending his hand. "I know a place where you'll be safe." She hesitated, her gaze searching his face for any hint of betrayal. He held her stare, letting her see the sincerity in his eyes. Finally, she reached out, placing her delicate hand in his. The moment their skin touched, a jolt shot through him, her fingers cool and smooth, like polished stone, yet pulsing with a warmth that made his heart skip. It was strange, intoxicating, and wholly unexpected. "What's your name?" he asked as he pulled her to her feet, guiding her deeper into the maze of alleyways. "Nara," she murmured, her voice steadier now. "And you?" "Theo," he replied, flashing her a small, reassuring smile. "Don't worry, Nara. I'll get you out of this." They moved swiftly, sticking to the shadows and dodging the glow of surveillance drones. Questions burned in Theo's mind. Where had she come from? How had she ended up here? But he pushed them aside. Survival came first. His safe house wasn't far, a cramped bolt hole he'd kept secret even from his closest contacts. If they could reach it, they'd have a chance to breathe, to plan. But as they neared the spaceport's edge, a wall of armored figures emerged from the mist. Enforcers, their visors gleaming under the neon lights. Theo's stomach dropped. They weren't just patrolling, they were waiting. Someone had tipped them off. "Stay close," he muttered to Nara, his grip tightening on her hand. She nodded, her trust in him shining through her fear. He took a deep breath, his mind racing for an escape route. The enforcers hadn't spotted them yet, but it was only a matter of seconds. With a sudden burst of speed, he yanked Nara toward a side passage, a narrow corridor barely wide enough for two. Shouts erupted behind them as they sprinted over the metal grates, their footsteps ringing out like gunshots in the confined space. They'd almost made it when a figure stepped into their path, a syndicate thug, his scarred face twisted into a sneer. "Going somewhere?" he growled, flicking a plasma blade to life. The weapon hummed with lethal energy, its blue glow casting eerie shadows. Theo didn't think. He let go of Nara's hand and charged, slamming into the thug with all his weight. They hit the ground hard, grappling in a tangle of limbs. The blade skittered across the floor, and Nara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Theo's fists flew, fueled by adrenaline and desperation. The thug was strong, but Theo was faster, landing a solid punch to the jaw that sent the man sprawling, unconscious, panting. Theo staggered to his feet and turned to Nara. "Let's go," he urged, grabbing her hand again. They burst out of the passage and into the open, the safe house just blocks away. But as they rounded the final corner, Theo's hope shattered. The building was surrounded, syndicate enforcers, their weapons drawn, their eyes scanning the night. There was no way in. "We're trapped," Nara whispered, her voice trembling. Theo's mind raced. They couldn't fight their way through, and surrender wasn't an option. Then it hit him, the old maintenance tunnels beneath the city. They were a death trap, unstable and forgotten, but they were also their only shot. "This way," he said, pulling her toward a rusted grate in the pavement. With a grunt, he pried it open, the metal groaning under his hands. "Go," he told her, gesturing to the dark shaft below. She hesitated, her eyes wide with terror. "Trust me," he said, his voice soft but firm, his gaze locking with hers. After a heartbeat, she nodded and climbed down, disappearing into the shadows. Theo followed, pulling the grate shut behind them. The tunnel swallowed them whole, the air thick with dampness and the stench of decay. It was tight, the walls pressing in, but it was cover. For now, they were safe. They navigated the twisting passages in silence. The only sound their ragged breathing and the drip of water somewhere in the distance. Theo couldn't help but steal glances at Nara as they moved. Even in the dim light, she was mesmerizing, her graceful movements, the way her leather clung to her skin. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus. This was about survival, not whatever that feeling was. At last, they stumbled into a small chamber, a relic of Zarathia's ancient undercity. It was bare, just a cot, a table, and a flickering lantern. But it was enough. Theo lit the lantern, its soft glow bathing the room in warmth. "You should be safe here," he said, setting it down. The light danced across Nara's features, highlighting the curve of her cheekbones, the shimmer of her skin. She was beautiful, alien and familiar all at once. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." Theo managed a tired smile. "I couldn't leave you there. No one deserves that." She stepped closer, her eyes glistening with emotion. "You're different," she said softly. "Kinder than I expected. Braver." Heat crept up his neck, and he shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "Just doing what's right." Nara reached out, her fingers brushing his cheek. The touch was electric, sending a shiver through him. "In my world, kindness is rare. You've saved me. Theo, I owe you everything." He swallowed hard, his pulse racing. "You don't owe me anything. I'm just glad you're okay." But as she leaned in, her breath warm against his skin, her lips hovering so close he could feel their pull, Theo knew this was more than a simple rescue. Something unspoken passed between them, a spark that defied the chaos around them. And in that quiet, hidden chamber, with the world above hunting them down, he realized his life had just changed forever. The flickering lantern cast dancing shadows across the damp walls of the underground chamber, its feeble glow barely holding back the darkness that pressed in from all sides. Theo's pulse still thrummed from the chase, his muscles taut, But the air between him and Nara felt heavier now, charged with something unspoken. Her touch lingered on his cheek, her jade-green skin cool yet searing, and as she leaned closer, her breath a whisper against his face. Theo felt a pull he couldn't explain. It wasn't just her beauty, though that alone was enough to unravel him. It was the way her eyes held his, fierce and vulnerable, like a storm trapped in a fragile shell. Nara's lips parted, as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, her gaze dropped to his mouth, and Theo's throat tightened. He should pull back, focus on their next move. But his body betrayed him, rooted to the spot. The chamber felt smaller, the air thicker, as if the world had shrunk to just the two of them. Her scent, something wild, like ozone and blooming starflowers, filled his senses, dizzying him. "We can't stay here long," he managed, his voice rougher than he intended. He forced himself to step back, breaking the spell of her closeness, though every fiber of his being screamed to stay. "The Syndicate has eyes everywhere. They'll find these tunnels eventually." Nara nodded, her ears twitching slightly, catching sounds he couldn't hear. "They're relentless," she said, her voice low, almost a purr that sent a shiver down his spine. "But you're not like them. You're not like anyone I've met." Theo swallowed, turning to the table to busy his hands, checking the meager supplies he'd stashed here months ago. A few ration bars, a med kit, a battered comms device. Anything to keep his mind off the way her leather clung to her curves, the way her eyes seemed to see straight through him. "I'm just a guy trying to survive," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "Same as anyone in Zarathia." "No," she said, stepping closer again, her movements graceful, almost predatory. "You could have left me. You didn't. That makes you extraordinary." Her words stirred something in him. Pride, maybe, or something deeper. Something he wasn't ready to name. He turned to face her, and she was closer now. Too close, her body inches from his. The lantern light caught the shimmer of her skin, highlighting the delicate lines of her collarbone, the soft swell of her chest beneath the torn leather. Theo's breath hitched, and he clenched his fist to keep from reaching for her. "We need a plan," he said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "The tunnels can get us out of the spaceport, but we'll need to move fast. There's a smuggler's route that leads to the outer districts. It's risky, but—" "Risky?" Nara interrupted, her voice soft but edged with something that made his pulse spike. She tilted her head, her white hair falling like a curtain over one shoulder. "You've already risked everything for me." "Theo, why?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. He didn't have an answer, not one that made sense. He'd acted on instinct, driven by the sight of her fear, her strength, her everything. "Because it was right," he said finally, but the words felt inadequate, like they couldn't capture the fire she'd ignited in him. Nara's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile, and she stepped even closer, her body brushing against his. The contact was electric, a spark that jolted through him, and he couldn't stop the way his hand instinctively found her waist, steadying her, or maybe himself. "Right?" she murmured, her voice a velvet caress. "Or because you felt it too? This connection?" Theo's heart pounded so loudly he was sure she could hear it. Her words were bold, unapologetic, and they stirred a heat in him that was as thrilling as it was dangerous. He should pull away, keep his focus on survival. But her closeness was intoxicating, her scent wrapping around him like a spell. "Nara," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "We don't have time for this." But even as he spoke, his hand tightened on her waist, his fingers tracing the edge of her leather clothing, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath. She didn't pull back. Instead, she leaned in, her lips hovering so close to his that he could feel the heat of her breath. "Time," she whispered, "is all we have right now." Before he could respond, a distant clang echoed through the tunnels, sharp and jarring. Theo's head snapped toward the sound, his senses instantly on high alert. Nara tensed, her ears twitching as she turned toward the noise. "They're coming," she said, her voice barely audible, but laced with fear. Theo cursed under his breath. The spell between them shattered. He grabbed the comms device from the table, shoving it into his pocket, and pulled a small plasma pistol from a hidden compartment. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. "We need to move," he said, his tone all business now, though his body still buzzed from her closeness. "Stay behind me." Nara nodded, but as they moved toward the tunnel's exit, she grabbed his arm, her touch firm yet gentle. "Theo," she said, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "Whatever happens, I'm with you." The words hit him harder than they should have, stirring a mix of protectiveness and desire that he didn't have time to untangle. He gave her a curt nod, then led the way into the tunnel, the pistol gripped tightly in his hand. The air grew colder as they descended deeper, the walls narrowing until they had to move single file, their shoulders brushing against the damp stone. Every sound, every drip of water, every faint creak set Theo's nerves on edge. The syndicate was out there, and they weren't the type to give up easily. As they navigated the twisting passages, Theo couldn't shake the memory of Nara's touch, the way her body had pressed against his. It was a distraction he couldn't afford, but it lingered, a heat that pulsed beneath his skin. He glanced back at her, catching the way her eyes gleamed in the dim light, her movements fluid and graceful, even in this cramped, suffocating space. She was a mystery, an alien beauty who had crashed into his life and turned it upside down in a matter of hours. "Up ahead," he whispered, pointing to a faint glow where the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. "That's our way out. If we can reach the smuggler's route, we'll be clear of the spaceport." But as they approached the chamber, a low hum filled the air, growing louder with each step. Theo's stomach twisted. He recognized that sound. Hover drones, the syndicate's favorite tool for flushing out prey. He motioned for Nara to stay low, pressing himself against the wall as he peered into the chamber. Sure enough, 3 sleek drones hovered in the center, their red sensors sweeping the area, their plasma cannons primed. "We can't go through," Nara whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. "Is there another way?" Theo's mind raced. The smuggler's route was their best shot, but the drones blocked the only entrance. Fighting them was suicide. His pistol was no match for their firepower. But there was a maintenance shaft nearby, a risky detour that could collapse at any moment. It was a gamble, but so was standing still. "This way," he said, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward a rusted hatch in the wall. Her fingers laced with his, her grip surprisingly strong, and he felt that same jolt of electricity from before, a reminder of the connection she'd spoken of. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the hatch. It groaned as he forced it open, revealing a dark, narrow shaft that sloped downward at a treacherous angle. Nara hesitated, her eyes wide as she peered into the abyss. "It's not safe," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing about this is safe," Theo replied, his tone softer now, almost pleading. "But I won't let anything happen to you. I promise." Her gaze met his, and for a moment, the world fell away again. There was trust in her eyes, but also something more, a spark that made his blood hum. She nodded, and they climbed into the shaft, sliding down into the unknown. The metal was slick with moisture, and Theo braced himself against the walls, keeping Nara close as they descended. Her body pressed against his, her warmth seeping through his clothes, and he gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. The shaft opened into another tunnel, this one wider but no less oppressive. The air was thick with dust, and the faint glow of bioluminescent fungi cast an eerie light. Theo helped Nara to her feet, their hands lingering together a moment longer than necessary. "We're close," he said, his voice low. "Just a little further." But as they moved forward, a new sound reached them, a low, guttural growl that didn't belong to any drone. Theo froze, his pistol raised, his heart hammering. Something was in the tunnel with them, Something alive. Nara's hand tightened on his arm, her breath quickening. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice laced with fear and something else. Something that sent a thrill through him despite the danger. "Stay behind me," he said, his eyes scanning the shadows. Whatever it was close, and it was coming for them. The guttural growl reverberated through the tunnel, a primal sound that seemed to claw at the very walls, sending a chill racing down Theo's spine. His grip on the plasma pistol tightened, its faint hum barely audible over the pounding of his heart. Nara pressed closer behind him, her breath hot and uneven against his neck, her hand still clutching his arm with a strength that surprised him. The bioluminescent fungi cast an eerie glow, painting their surroundings in shades of sickly green and blue. But the light only deepened the shadows, hiding whatever lurked just beyond their sight. "Theo," Nara whispered, her voice trembling yet sharp with urgency. "What is that?" "I don't know," he admitted, his eyes scanning the darkness. The tunnel stretched ahead, its curves vanishing into an abyss where the growl had originated. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but there was no going back, not with the Syndicate's drones blocking the chamber behind them. They were caught between a known threat and an unknown terror, and Theo wasn't sure which was worse. "Stay close," he said, his tone low but firm, trying to mask the fear gnawing at him. Nara nodded, her body brushing against his as she moved to follow. The contact sent a jolt through him, a fleeting distraction that he pushed aside. There was no room for the heat of her presence now, not when something was stalking them. He took a cautious step forward, the pistol raised, its barrel glinting faintly in the fungal glow. The air was thick with dust and the sharp tang of decay, and each breath felt like a gamble. The growl came again, closer this time, a deep, rumbling menace that seemed to vibrate in his bones. Nara's fingers dug into his arm, and he glanced back to see her eyes wide, her bat-like ears twitching frantically as they caught sounds he couldn't. "It's moving," she hissed, her voice barely audible. "It's circling us." Theo's stomach twisted. He'd heard rumors of creatures in Zarathia's undercity, mutated beasts left over from the planet's failed terraforming experiments. Or worse, smugglers' pets abandoned in the tunnels. Whatever this was, it wasn't friendly. He motioned for Nara to stay low and crept forward, his boots silent against the damp stone. The tunnel widened slightly, opening into a cavernous chamber littered with rusted machinery and broken crates, relics of a time when these passages were used for more than hiding. A flash of movement caught his eye, a shadow darting between two towering stacks of debris. Theo swung the pistol toward it, his heart hammering. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls, sharper than he intended. The sound seemed to provoke whatever was out there, and the growl turned into a snarl, low and menacing, followed by the scrape of claws against metal. Nara grabbed his shoulder, pulling him back just as something massive lunged from the shadows. Theo fired instinctively, the plasma bolt lighting up the chamber in a brilliant flash. The creature, a hulking reptilian thing with jagged spines and glowing amber eyes, reared back, its scales glinting as it let out a bone-rattling roar. It was enormous, its body coiling like a serpent, its claws tearing into the ground as it prepared to charge again. "Run!" Theo yelled, shoving Nara toward a narrow passage on the far side of the chamber. She stumbled but caught herself, her movements swift and graceful despite her fear. Theo fired again, the plasma bolts sizzling through the air, but the creature was fast, weaving between the shots with terrifying agility. It lunged, its jaws snapping inches from Theo's leg, and he dove to the side, rolling across the ground as Nara screamed his name. "Theo, behind you!" Her voice was a desperate plea, and he spun just in time to see the creature's tail whip toward him, its spines gleaming with venom. He threw himself flat, the tail missing him by a hair, smashing into a crate and sending shards of metal flying. Nara was at his side in an instant, pulling him to his feet, her strength surprising him again. Her eyes burned with a mix of fear and defiance, and for a split second, Theo was struck by how fiercely beautiful she was, even in the face of death. We can't outrun it, she said, her voice steady now, her hands still gripping his. We have to fight. Theo nodded, his mind racing. The creature was circling again, its eyes locked on them. But the chamber offered cover, piles of debris, rusted pipes, a chance to outmaneuver it. Over there, he said, pointing to a cluster of machinery. If we can trap it, I can get a clean shot. They moved together, their steps synchronized as if they'd been running from monsters their whole lives. The creature snarled, its claws scraping as it followed, its massive body barely fitting through the narrower sections of the chamber. Theo's heart pounded, but Nara's presence beside him was a strange anchor, her determination fueling his own. They ducked behind a towering stack of crates, and Theo motioned for her to stay low as he peered out, tracking the creature's movements. It was closer now, its breath a guttural hiss that sent shivers through him. Theo steadied his pistol, aiming for the glowing eyes, but before he could fire, Nara grabbed his arm. Wait, she whispered, her voice urgent. She pointed to a rusted pipe overhead, its supports crumbling under the weight of years. If we can bring that down, it might pin it. Theo's eyes widened. It was a long shot, but it was better than trading shots with a beast that seemed to shrug off plasma fire. Cover me, he said, handing her the pistol. Her fingers brushed his as she took it, and even in the chaos, that touch sent a spark through him, a reminder of the connection that had flared between them in the safe house. Nara nodded, her grip on the pistol steady, despite the fear in her eyes. She fired a series of shots, the bolt zipping through the air, drawing the creature's attention. It roared, charging toward her, and Theo seized the moment. He sprinted to the base of the pipe, climbing the debris to reach its supports. His hands shook as he yanked at the rusted bolts, the metal groaning under his weight. The creature was almost on Nara now, its jaws snapping, but she held her ground, firing with a precision that stunned him. Come on, Theo muttered, his muscles straining as he tore at the supports. With a final wrench, the pipe gave way, crashing down with a deafening clang. The creature howled as the heavy metal slammed into its back, pinning it to the ground. Dust billowed, and for a moment, the chamber was silent, save for the creature's labored breathing. Theo slid down the debris, his chest heaving, and ran to Nara's side. She was still holding the pistol, her eyes wide but fierce, her jade skin glistening with sweat. You okay? He asked, his voice raw. She nodded, handing him the pistol, her fingers lingering against his. Thanks to you, she said, her voice soft but heavy with emotion. You didn't hesitate. Neither did you, he replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. He wanted to say more, to ask about the fire in her eyes, the way she'd fought like a warrior despite her fear. But a low groan from the creature cut him off. It was still alive, struggling beneath the pipe, its amber eyes glaring with hatred. We need to go, Nara said, her voice urgent. It won't stay down long. Theo nodded, but as they turned to flee, a new sound stopped them cold, a rhythmic thumping, like boots on stone, coming from the tunnel they'd entered. The syndicate had found them. Theo's heart sank, but as he looked at Nara, her face set with determination, he felt a surge of resolve. They'd survived the beast. They could survive this. Stay with me, he said, grabbing her hand, her fingers laced with his, her grip firm. And together they ran toward the smuggler's route, the sounds of pursuit growing louder behind them. The tunnel narrowed again, forcing them close, their bodies brushing with every step. Theo's pulse raced, not just from the danger, but from the heat of her touch. The way her presence seemed to ignite something reckless in him. As they rounded a corner, the tunnel opened into a vast underground hangar, its ceiling crisscrossed with rusted beams. A battered smuggling ship sat in the center, its hull scarred but intact. Theo's heart leaped. It was their way out. But before he could speak, a figure stepped from the shadows, blocking their path. A syndicate enforcer, his armor gleaming, a plasma rifle leveled at them. End of the line, the enforcer growled, his voice cold and final. Theo froze, his mind racing for a way out, but Nara's hand tightened on his, her eyes blazing with a defiance that took his breath away. "Not yet," she whispered, and in that moment, Theo knew they were far from done. The Enforcer's plasma rifle glinted in the dim light of the underground hangar, its barrel trained on Theo and Nara with lethal intent. Theo's heart thudded, his mind scrambling for a way out. But the cold certainty in the Enforcer's stance told him there was no talking their way through this. Nara's grip on his hand tightened, her jade-green skin warm against his, her defiance a quiet fire that steadied him even now. The smuggler's ship loomed behind the Enforcer, so close yet impossibly far, a rusted lifeline dangling just out of reach. "Not yet," Nara had whispered, and those words still hung in the air, a challenge to the universe itself. Theo glanced at her, catching the spark in her luminous eyes, and despite the rifle pointed at his chest, he felt a reckless surge of hope. They'd faced a monster and lived. This was just one man, armored, armed, and smug, but still just one man. "Drop the pistol," the Enforcer barked, his voice distorted through his helmet's comms. "And step away from the girl. She's Syndicate property." Theo's jaw clenched, his fingers twitching around the grip of his plasma pistol. "She's no one's property," he shot back, his voice sharper than he meant it to be. The words felt good, righteous, but the Enforcer's chuckle, low and mocking, made his stomach twist. "Big talk for a dead man," the Enforcer said, taking a step forward. "Hand her over, and maybe I'll let you walk away." "Maybe—" Nara's ears twitched, and she pressed closer to Theo, her body brushing against his side. The contact was distracting, her warmth seeping through his clothes, and for a split second, his mind wandered to the curve of her waist, the way her leather clung to her skin. He shook his head, cursing himself. Focus, Theo. But Nara seemed to sense his distraction, and to his surprise, she leaned into it, her voice dropping to a sultry whisper that carried just enough for the Enforcer to hear. "He's not handing me over," she said, her tone laced with a confidence that made Theo's pulse spike. "And you're not as scary as you think you are." The Enforcer froze, clearly thrown by her defiance. Theo stifled a laugh. Her audacity was as disarming as it was dangerous. But before the Enforcer could respond, Nara took it a step further, sliding her arm around Theo's waist, her fingers grazing the edge of his belt in a way that sent heat flooding through him. "Besides," she added, her voice dripping with mischief, "I'm already spoken for." Theo's eyes widened, his face flushing, despite the life-or-death stakes. What is she doing? The Enforcer's rifle wavered slightly, his confusion palpable even through the helmet. "What the hell are you talking about?" he growled, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Nara didn't miss a beat. She pressed herself closer to Theo, her lips curling into a sly smile as she tilted her head up to meet his gaze. "Tell him, Theo," she purred, her voice loud enough to carry. "Tell him you're not giving me up." Theo's mouth went dry, his brain struggling to catch up. Was she playing a game to throw the Enforcer off? Or was there something real in the way her body molded against his? Either way, her act was working. The Enforcer was hesitating, his rifle dipping slightly. Theo decided to play along, though his voice came out rougher than he intended. "She's right," he said, wrapping his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "She's with me, so back off." The Enforcer snorted, but the moment of distraction was all they needed. Nara's hand slipped from Theo's waist to the pistol at his side, her movements so smooth he barely registered them. In a flash, she yanked the weapon free and fired, the plasma bolt sizzling past the Enforcer's shoulder, singeing his armor. He stumbled back, cursing, and Theo didn't hesitate. He tackled Nara to the ground, rolling them behind a stack of crates as the Enforcer returned fire, plasma bolts scorching the air where they'd stood. "That was bold," Theo panted, his body pressed against hers in the cramped space. Her scent, wild and electric, filled his senses, and he was acutely aware of how close they were, her curves soft against his chest. Also, spoken for. Really? Nara grinned, her eyes glinting with mischief despite the chaos. It worked, didn't it? She whispered, her breath warm against his ear. And you didn't exactly complain. Theo's face burned, and he muttered something incoherent, earning a soft laugh from her that was entirely too distracting. The enforcer's shout snapped him back to reality, followed by the heavy tread of more boots approaching. Reinforcements! Theo peered over the crate, spotting two more enforcers entering the hangar, their rifles sweeping the area. We're not getting to that ship without a fight, he said, his mind racing. The hangar was a maze of crates and machinery, offering plenty of cover, but also endless places for the enemy to hide. He glanced at Nara, her face set with determination, and an idea struck him, one so absurd it might just work. Follow my lead, he said, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward a rusted fuel canister tucked against the wall. And try not to laugh. Laugh? She echoed, but there was no time to explain. Theo kicked the canister, sending it rolling across the hangar floor with a loud clatter. The enforcers turned toward the noise, their rifles trained on the canister as it spun, leaking a faint trail of volatile fuel. Theo aimed his pistol and fired, the bolt igniting the trail in a spectacular burst of flame that lit up the hangar like a supernova. The enforcers shouted, diving for cover as the fire spread, licking at the crates and casting wild shadows. Theo and Nara sprinted toward the ship, their hands still clasped, their footsteps pounding in sync. The heat of the flames was intense, but so was the heat of her hand in his, the way her fingers squeezed his with every step. They reached the ship's hatch, and Theo slammed his fist against the control panel, praying the old codes he'd memorized still worked. The hatch hissed open, and they tumbled inside, collapsing onto the cold metal floor of the cockpit. Theo scrambled to the controls, his fingers flying over the console as he powered up the engines. The ship groaned, its systems sluggish from years of neglect, but it was their only shot. Outside, the enforcers were regrouping, their shouts growing louder as they closed in. Nara knelt beside him, her shoulder brushing his as she watched the console light up. "Can you fly this thing?" she asked, her voice teasing despite the urgency. Theo shot her a grin, his confidence bolstered by her presence. "I've flown worse," he said, though the truth was he'd only ever piloted simulators and a few junkers. "Hold on tight." The engines roared to life, shaking the ship as it lifted off the ground, the hangar's ceiling looming closer with every second. The enforcers fired, plasma bolts pinging off the hull, but Theo yanked the controls, banking the ship sharply to avoid the worst of the barrage. Nara grabbed his arm, her nails digging in. Not from fear, he realized but from excitement, her eyes blazing with a wild energy that matched his own. They burst through the hangar's skylight, glass and metal raining down as the ship soared into Zarathia's neon-lit sky. The city sprawled below them, a chaotic tapestry of lights and shadows. But Theo's focus was on the stars ahead, and on Nara, who was still gripping his arm, her laughter ringing out over the hum of the engines. "You're insane," she said, her voice a mix of awe and amusement. "I like it," Theo chuckled, his heart still racing from the escape, and from her. "Yeah, well, stick with me, and it's only going to get crazier." But as they climbed higher, a warning light flashed on the console, its shrill beep cutting through their moment of triumph. Theo's stomach dropped as he read the alert. Fuel leak detected. The canister he'd ignited had done more than distract the enforcers. It had damaged the ship. They weren't out of danger yet. Nara's hand found his again, her touch steadying him even as the ship began to shudder. "What now?" she asked, her voice calm but expectant, as if she already knew he'd find a way. Theo met her gaze, the spark between them flaring even in the face of disaster. "Now," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We find a place to land before this thing blows us to the stars." The smuggler's ship rattled as it broke through Zarathia's upper atmosphere, the stars stretching out before them like a glittering promise of freedom. But the warning light on the console blinked relentlessly, its shrill beep a constant reminder of the fuel leak threatening to end their escape. Theo's hands gripped the controls, his jaw tight as he scanned for a safe landing zone. The outer districts were too hot, crawling with syndicate patrols, but there was a derelict mining outpost on Zarathia's moon. Netheria, a risky bet, but their only shot. Nara sat beside him, her presence a steady anchor, her hand still resting on his arm, her touch warm and grounding despite the chaos. "Netheria's our best chance," Theo said, his voice steady even as the ship shuddered again. "It's abandoned. Mostly. We can lay low, patch the ship, and figure out our next move." Nara nodded, her luminous eyes catching the starlight filtering through the cockpit's viewport. "I trust you," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made his chest tighten. Her fingers lingered on his arm, tracing slow, deliberate patterns that sent a shiver through him. The cockpit was small, the air thick with the hum of the engines and something else, something electric, unspoken, that had been building since their first touch in the tunnels. Theo tried to focus on the controls, but her closeness was maddening. Her scent, wild and intoxicating, like a storm on an alien sea, filled the cramped space, and every brush of her body against his as the ship jolted sent heat coursing through him. He stole a glance at her, catching the way her leather clothing hugged her curves, the way her white hair fell in soft waves, framing her jade-green skin. She was mesmerizing, and the way she looked at him, like he was more than just a scavenger scraping by in Zarathia's shadows, made his pulse race. The ship lurched, snapping him back to reality. "Hold on," he muttered, adjusting the thrusters to stabilize their descent. Netheria's surface loomed closer, a barren landscape of jagged craters and abandoned mining rigs bathed in pale starlight. The ship groaned as it touched down, skidding across the rocky terrain before coming to a stop near a crumbling outpost. The engines sputtered, then fell silent, leaving only the soft hum of the life support systems and the rapid beat of Theo's heart. "We made it," Nara said, her voice a mix of relief and something deeper, something that made Theo's skin prickle. She unbuckled her harness and turned to him, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that stole his breath. "You got us out." "Barely," Theo replied, managing a crooked smile despite the tension coiling in his gut. He unbuckled his own harness and stood, checking the console for damage reports. The fuel leak was worse than he'd thought. They had maybe a day's worth of power left, if they were lucky. "We need to fix this thing fast, or we're not going anywhere." Nara rose, her movements fluid and graceful, and stepped closer, closing the small distance between them. "You're always thinking ahead," she murmured, her voice low and warm, like a secret shared in the dark. "But right now, we're alive. That's because of you." Her words hit him hard, stirring something raw and unguarded. He turned to face her, and she was closer than he expected, her body inches from his, her breath warm against his cheek. The cockpit's dim lighting cast soft shadows across her face, highlighting the curve of her lips, the shimmer of her skin. Theo's hands twitched at his sides, itching to reach for her, but he hesitated, his mind warring between caution and the pull of her presence. "Nara," he started, his voice rough. "We should check the outpost, make sure it's secure." But she cut him off, stepping even closer, her hand finding his chest, her fingers splaying across his shirt. The touch was gentle but deliberate, sending a wave of heat through him that made his breath hitch. "Theo," she said, her voice a soft caress. "We've been running, fighting, surviving, just for a moment. Can we stop?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Theo's heart pounded, his resolve crumbling under the weight of her gaze. Her hand slid up to his shoulder, then to the back of his neck, her fingers threading through his hair. The sensation was electric, and he couldn't stop himself from leaning into her touch, his hands finally finding her waist, pulling her closer. Her body fit against his like it was meant to be there, soft yet strong, her curves pressing against him in a way that made his head spin. "Nara," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. This, this is dangerous." She smiled, a slow, knowing curve of her lips that sent a thrill through him. "Dangerous," she echoed, her voice teasing but laced with something deeper, something that made his blood hum. "We just outran a monster in the syndicate. I think we can handle this." Her words were bold, but there was a vulnerability in her eyes, a question she wasn't asking aloud. Theo's hands tightened on her waist, his fingers tracing the edge of her leather clothing, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath. The air between them crackled, charged with a tension that had been building since the moment he'd found her in that alley. He leaned in, his lips brushing hers, tentative at first, testing the waters. She responded instantly, her lips soft and warm against his, her kiss a mix of hunger and tenderness that took his breath away. The world fell away. The ship, the syndicate, the looming threat of their dwindling fuel, all of it faded as he deepened the kiss, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. Her hands roamed his back, her nails grazing his skin through his shirt, sending shivers down his spine. The taste of her was intoxicating, like spice and starlight, and he couldn't get enough. They stumbled back, collapsing onto the pilot's chair, Nara straddling his lap as the kiss grew more urgent. Her leather creaked softly as she moved, her body pressing against his in a way that made his head spin. His hands slid up her sides, tracing the curves he'd been trying not to notice, and she let out a soft sigh that sent heat pooling in his core. The moment was raw, electric, a collision of need and relief after everything they'd been through. But even as he lost himself in her, a part of Theo's mind stayed sharp, alert to the danger they were still in. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers, both of them breathing hard. "Nara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We can't. Not here. Not yet." She looked at him, her eyes half-lidded, her lips swollen from their kiss. "Why not?" she asked, her voice a playful challenge, though there was a flicker of understanding in her gaze. "Because I want to do this right," he said, his thumb brushing her cheek, tracing the shimmer of her jade skin. "And because we're not safe yet, we need to check the outpost, fix the ship. But after that," he let the words trail off, a promise hanging between them. Nara's smile was soft, almost shy, a stark contrast to the boldness of moments before. "After that," she echoed, leaning in to press a quick, teasing kiss to his lips before sliding off his lap. "You're a good man, Theo. Too good. Maybe," he chuckled, the tension easing slightly, though his body still buzzed from her touch. "Yeah, well, don't spread that around. I've got a reputation to maintain." She laughed, a sound that lit up the cockpit, and for a moment, the weight of their situation felt lighter. They moved to the hatch, Theo grabbing a toolkit from the ship's storage while Nara adjusted her leather, her movements graceful yet deliberate, as if she knew he was watching. The outpost awaited them outside, a dark silhouette against Netheria's barren landscape, and Theo couldn't shake the feeling that their moment of reprieve was just that, a moment. As they stepped onto the moon's surface, the cold air biting at their skin, Theo glanced at Nara, her white hair glowing faintly in the starlight. The spark between them hadn't faded. It was there, simmering, waiting for the next chance to ignite. But for now, survival came first. The outpost shadows loomed ahead, and with them, the promise of new dangers and new possibilities. The cold air of Netheria's surface stung Theo's skin as he and Nara stepped out of the ship, the derelict mining outpost looming before them like a skeleton of forgotten ambitions. The starlight cast long shadows across the cracked ground, and the silence of the moon was unnerving after the chaos of their escape. Nara's white hair glowed faintly, her jade-green skin shimmering as she moved beside him. Her presence a quiet reassurance despite the uncertainty ahead. The memory of their kiss in the cockpit lingered, a warm pulse beneath his skin, but Theo forced his focus to the task at hand, securing the outpost and fixing the ship before the syndicate tracked them down. He clutched the toolkit tightly, his other hand hovering near his plasma pistol as they approached the outpost's rusted entrance. Nara's bat-like ears twitched, catching sounds he couldn't hear, and her eyes scanned the darkness with a wariness that matched his own. "This place feels wrong," she murmured, her voice low but carrying a weight that made his stomach twist. "Abandoned outposts usually do," Theo replied, trying to sound confident as he pried open the door's control panel. The wiring was a mess, but he dealt with worse. "We'll check the perimeter, find some fuel cells, and get out of here before anyone knows we're here." Nara nodded, but her gaze lingered on him, her expression unreadable. "You make it sound simple," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "But nothing about this has been simple, has it?" Theo chuckled, the sound easing the tension in his chest. "You've got a point." He wanted to say more, to tease her about the way she'd thrown him off balance in the cockpit, but the panel sparked under his hands and the door groaned open, revealing a dark corridor that swallowed the starlight. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of rust and something sharper, almost metallic. Theo gestured for Nara to stay close, and they stepped inside, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The outpost was a labyrinth of narrow halls and abandoned workstations, their surfaces coated in dust. Theo's flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating faded signs and broken equipment, relics of a mining operation long since abandoned. Nara moved beside him, her movements graceful yet cautious, her hand brushing his arm occasionally as if to reassure herself he was still there. Each touch sent a spark through him, a reminder of the heat between them, but the eerie stillness of the outpost kept his senses sharp. They reached a central chamber, its ceiling high and vaulted, lined with massive fuel tanks that glinted faintly in the flashlight's beam. "Jackpot," Theo muttered, relief washing over him. If even one of those tanks was functional, they could refuel the ship and get off this rock. He set the toolkit down and started inspecting the tanks, his fingers tracing the cold metal for signs of integrity. Nara stood watch, her eyes scanning the shadows. "This place isn't as empty as it seems," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can feel something, like we're being watched." Theo glanced up, his hand pausing on a valve. "Your ears picking up something I'm missing?" he asked, half teasing, but her serious expression made his stomach tighten. "It's not just my ears," she said, her voice low and urgent. "It's a feeling." "Back on my world, we learned to trust instincts like this. Something's here." "Theo," before he could respond, a low hum filled the chamber, growing louder until it vibrated in his chest. The lights flickered on, bathing the room in a harsh, sterile glow that revealed something Theo hadn't noticed before. A sleek, metallic pod in the corner, its surface etched with symbols that pulsed faintly, almost alive. Nara's eyes widened, and she took a step back, her hand gripping his arm tightly. "What is that?" Theo asked, his voice steady despite the unease creeping up his spine. The pod looked out of place, too advanced for an old mining outpost, its design alien in a way that made his skin crawl. Nara's breath hitched, her ears flattening against her head. That's a stasis chamber," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and recognition. "From my people. But it shouldn't be here." Theo's mind raced. "Your people? You mean?" He stopped, the pieces clicking together too fast, too impossibly. "Nara, how did you end up in Zarathia? You said you escaped, but you never told me from what, or who." She turned to him, her eyes glistening with something he couldn't name. Guilt, maybe, or sorrow. "I was running from them," she said, her voice barely audible. "The ones who built that pod, my own kind." The words hit him like a plasma bolt, a twist he hadn't seen coming. "Your kind?" he repeated, his voice rising despite himself. "You said the syndicate was after you. You never mentioned—" "I didn't lie," she cut in, her voice sharp but pleading. "The syndicate is after me?" But they're working with my people, or what's left of them, the ones who sold me out, who wanted to use me for experiments. She gestured to the pod, her hand trembling. That's what this is. A lab. They were studying me, trying to unlock something in my blood, something they think can change everything. Theo's head spun, the weight of her words sinking in. He thought she was just a runaway, a victim of the syndicate's cruelty. But this was something bigger, something that made his blood run cold. "What's in your blood, Nara?" he asked, his voice low, almost afraid of the answer. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know exactly," she admitted, "but they called it the key. Something about my biology, my connection to the old worlds. They think it can control things, machines, energies, things they don't even fully understand." Before Theo could press further, the pod hissed, its lid sliding open with a mechanical whine. A figure emerged, tall, with white hair and jade skin like Nara's, but its eyes were cold, almost lifeless, glowing with an unnatural light. It wore a sleek, armored suit that hummed with energy, and in its hand was a weapon unlike anything Theo had seen, a pulsing orb that crackled with power. "Nara," the figure said, its voice a chilling echo of hers. "You cannot run forever. The key belongs to us." Nara froze, her face pale, her hand tightening on Theo's arm until it hurt. "Tiva," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My sister." Theo's heart stopped. Sister? The word echoed in his mind, a betrayal and a revelation all at once. He'd thought he was saving Nara from the syndicate, from slavers. But this was personal, a family torn apart by something far darker than he'd imagined. He raised his pistol, stepping in front of Nara, his body shielding hers despite the fear clawing at him. "Stay back," he growled, his voice steady even as his mind reeled. "She's not going anywhere with you." Tiva's lips curved into a cold smile, her glowing eyes flicking to Theo. "You're brave, human," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But you're in over your head. Hand her over, or you'll both die here." The chamber hummed with tension, the air thick with the promise of violence. Theo's grip on the pistol tightened, his mind racing for a way out, but Nara's hand on his arm steadied him, her touch a reminder of the bond they'd forged. He glanced at her, seeing the fear in her eyes but also a fierce determination, a fire that matched his own. "We're not done running," Nara said, her voice steady now, her gaze locked on her sister. "And we're not giving up." Theo's heart swelled, her words igniting something reckless in him. Whatever this key was, whatever Nara was running from, he was in it now, fully, irrevocably. He tightened his grip on her hand, his eyes never leaving Tiva's. "You heard her," he said, his voice a low growl. "Come and get us." The air in the outpost chamber crackled with the energy of Tiva's glowing orb, its pulsing light casting eerie shadows across the rusted fuel tanks. Theo stood firm, his plasma pistol trained on Nara's sister, his heart pounding not just from the threat, but from the sting of her revelation. Nara's sister, Tiva, stood before them, her cold, glowing eyes and sleek armor a stark contrast to Nara's warmth and vulnerability. The betrayal cut deeper than Theo expected, and Nara's grip on his hand, tight and trembling, told him she felt it too. Yet, despite the danger, there was a fire in her stance, a defiance that made Theo's resolve burn brighter. "You can't have her," Theo said, his voice steady, though his mind reeled from the twist of facing Nara's own blood. "Whatever this key is, you're not taking her back to be some lab rat." Tiva's smile was razor sharp, her gaze flicking between Theo and Nara with a mix of amusement and disdain. "You think you understand human?" she said, her voice smooth but laced with venom. "Nara's not just a fugitive. She's the answer to everything. Our survival, our power. You're just a complication." Nara's breath hitched, and she stepped forward, her body brushing against Theo's as she faced her sister. "I'm not your answer, Tiva," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "I'm your sister, or I was, until you chose them over me." The words hung heavy, and for a moment, Tiva's expression flickered, something almost human passing through her glowing eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a cold resolve. "Sentiment won't save you," she said, raising the orb. Its energy flared, a low hum building to a deafening whine that made Theo's teeth ache. "Last chance. Nara, come willingly, or I'll take you in pieces." Theo's grip tightened on his pistol, but before he could fire, Nara did something that made his jaw drop. She stepped in front of him, her hands raised, and then laughed, a sharp, defiant sound that echoed through the chamber. "You always were dramatic, Tiva," she said, her tone laced with a sarcasm that caught Theo off guard. "But if you're going to threaten us, at least get some new lines. Those are older than this outpost." Theo blinked, torn between shock and amusement. Here they were, staring down a glowing death orb, and Nara was sassing her sister. He couldn't help it. A chuckle escaped him, loud enough to make Tiva's eyes narrow. "She's got a point," he said, unable to resist. "You sound like a hollow villain. Maybe try a monologue next time?" Tiva's face twisted in irritation, and Theo seized the moment. He grabbed Nara's arm and dove behind a fuel tank, just as the orb unleashed a blast of energy that scorched the air where they'd stood. The tank shuddered, metal groaning as the blast left a smoking crater in its side. Theo's heart raced, but Nara's laughter still rang in his ears, her boldness infectious even in the face of death. "Nice one," he muttered, pulling her close as they crouched behind the tank. Her body pressed against his, her warmth a stark contrast to the cold metal at his back. And despite the chaos, he was acutely aware of her closeness. Her eyes sparkled with a mix of fear and mischief, and for a moment, he forgot the danger, caught in the way her lips curved into a grin. "Had to lighten the mood," she whispered, her breath tickling his ear. "You looked like you were about to faint." "Faint?" Theo scoffed, though his face flushed at her teasing. "I'm saving your ass, remember?" "Oh, I remember," she said, her voice dropping to a playful purr that sent heat through him. "And I'm very grateful." Before he could respond to that, another blast rocked the chamber, sending sparks raining down. Tiva was advancing, her orb pulsing with renewed energy, and Theo realized they were running out of time. The tank wouldn't hold much longer, and the chamber offered little cover. His eyes darted to the ceiling, where a network of rusted pipes hung precariously, their supports weakened by years of neglect. "Nara," he said, his voice urgent. "Can you distract her? I've got an idea." She nodded, her eyes gleaming with understanding. "Keep up, hero," she said, and before he could protest, she darted out from behind the tank, moving with a grace that made his breath catch. "Hey, Tiva!" she shouted, her voice echoing. "Still mad I broke your favorite crystal when we were kids? Or is this about something else?" Tiva snarled, her attention snapping to Nara as she fired another blast. Nara dove behind a crate, her movements fluid, and Theo took his chance. He scrambled up a pile of debris, his hands slipping on the dusty metal as he climbed toward the pipes. His plan was reckless. Bring the ceiling down, trap Tiva, and buy them time to reach the fuel tanks. But it was all he had. As he reached the pipes, he glanced at Nara, who was still taunting Tiva, dodging blasts with a dancer's grace. "You never could keep up with me," she called, her voice a mix of defiance and glee. And Theo couldn't help but grin. She was incredible, fearless, and maybe a little insane, and he was starting to think he'd follow her anywhere. He yanked at the pipe's supports, the metal groaning under his hands. Tiva's orb flared again, and Nara yelped, diving behind another crate just as a blast scorched the ground. "Any time now, Theo," she shouted, her voice laced with mock impatience. "Working on it," he called back, his own voice tinged with humor despite the strain. The pipe gave way with a deafening screech, crashing down in a cloud of dust and debris. Tiva dove out of the way, but the falling metal clipped her arm, sending the orb skittering across the floor. It pulsed wildly, its energy unstable, and Theo's heart leaped. Maybe they had a chance. He slid down the debris, landing beside Nara, who was brushing dust off her leather with a dramatic sigh. "Took you long enough," she said, her eyes twinkling as she handed him his pistol, which she'd somehow retrieved in the chaos. "You're welcome," he shot back, their banter a bright spark in the tension. But the moment was short-lived. Tiva was already on her feet, her arm bleeding but her eyes blazing with fury. She lunged for the orb, and Theo realized with a sinking feeling that this fight was far from over. "Fuel tanks," he said, grabbing Nara's hand and pulling her toward the tanks. "We grab what we need and get to the ship. Now!" They sprinted across the chamber, dodging debris and Tiva's renewed blasts. The orb's energy was erratic now, sending arcs of light sparking across the room, and Theo's pulse raced as he realized it might explode. Nara kept pace, her hand in his, her trust in him a quiet strength that pushed him forward. They reached the tanks, and Theo worked frantically, detaching a fuel cell while Nara stood guard. Her eyes locked on Tiva. "Hurry," she urged, her voice tight. "She's coming." Theo's hands shook as he connected the fuel cell to a portable rig, his mind racing. They had the fuel, but Tiva was closing in, her orb glowing brighter, its hum a warning of impending disaster. He glanced at Nara, her face set with determination, and knew they'd face whatever came next together. But as they turned to run for the ship, a new sound stopped them, a low, mechanical whine from the pod Tiva had emerged from, followed by the unmistakable click of more chambers opening. Theo's blood ran cold. "What now?" he muttered, his grip tightening on the fuel cell. Nara's eyes widened, her ears twitching as she stared at the pod. "They're waking up," she whispered, her voice filled with dread. She wasn't alone. The mechanical whine of the stasis pods filled the chamber, a chilling chorus that echoed off the rusted walls as more lids began to hiss open. Theo's heart pounded, his grip on the fuel cell tightening as he exchanged a glance with Nara. Her jade-green eyes were wide with dread, her bat-like ears twitching frantically. But beneath the fear was a spark of defiance that hadn't dimmed. Tiva stood across the chamber, her glowing orb pulsing erratically in her hand, her cold smile unwavering despite the chaos unfolding around them. The realization that she wasn't alone, that others of Nara's kind were waking, sent a shiver through Theo. But he pushed it down. They had the fuel cell. They had each other. They could still make it out. "Nara," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to move. Now." She nodded, her hand finding his, her touch a steady anchor in the rising storm. "The ship," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in it. "We can outrun them." Theo didn't waste a second. He hoisted the fuel cell, its weight heavy but manageable, and pulled Nara toward the corridor leading back to the ship. Tiva's voice rang out behind them, sharp and commanding. "You can't escape! Nara! The key is ours, and you know it!" Nara's steps faltered, but Theo squeezed her hand, urging her forward. "Don't listen to her," he said, his tone fierce. "You're not their experiment. You're with me." Her eyes met his, and for a fleeting moment, the chaos faded, replaced by a warmth that made his chest ache. "With you," she echoed, a small smile breaking through her fear. And they ran, their footsteps pounding against the dusty floor. The corridor was a blur of rusted metal and flickering lights, the whine of the pods growing fainter but the threat of pursuit ever present. Theo's mind raced, calculating their odds. The ship was close, but the fuel cell needed to be installed, and Tiva, along with whatever was waking in those pods, wasn't far behind. He could hear her now, her boots echoing in the distance, her orbs hum a constant menace. They burst into the hangar, the smuggler's ship sitting like a battered beacon of hope under Netheria's starlit sky. Theo sprinted to the engine bay, Nara at his side, her hands steady as she helped him open the panel. "You know how to do this?" she asked, her voice teasing despite the urgency, a callback to their playful banter in the cockpit. "I'm learning as I go," Theo shot back, managing a grin as he connected the fuel cell. "But I'm a quick study," she laughed, a bright sound that cut through the tension, and for a moment, he felt invincible. But the moment shattered as a blast from Tiva's orb scorched the ground nearby, sending sparks flying. Theo ducked, pulling Nara down with him, their bodies pressed together behind the ship's landing gear. Her breath was warm against his cheek, her closeness a reminder of the spark that had ignited between them. And despite the danger, he couldn't help the way his heart raced at her touch. "Tiva's not giving up," Nara whispered, her eyes scanning the hangar. "She never does." "Then we don't either," Theo said, his voice steady. He finished securing the fuel cell, the engine humming to life with a reassuring rumble. "Get to the cockpit. I'll hold her off." Nara's eyes widened, her hand grabbing his arm. "Theo, no. We do this together." He met her gaze, seeing the fear but also the trust, the bond that had grown stronger with every near-death escape. "Together," he agreed, and they scrambled into the ship, sealing the hatch just as Tiva and two other figures emerged from the corridor. Tall, jade-skinned, their eyes glowing like hers, their armor glinting with menace. Theo dove into the pilot's chair, Nara beside him, her hands flying over the co-pilot controls with a confidence that surprised him. "You sure you don't want to take the wheel?" he teased, even as he powered up the thrusters. "Next time," she shot back, her smile fierce as the ship lifted off, shaking off the dust of Netheria's surface. Tiva's orb flared, sending a blast that grazed the hull, but Theo banked sharply, the ship responding with a groan, but holding steady. The other figures fired, their weapons crackling with energy, but the ship was already climbing, breaking through the thin atmosphere and into the vastness of space. The stars stretched out before them, an endless canvas of possibility. But Theo's relief was short-lived. A proximity alert blared, and Nara's eyes widened as she checked the sensors. "They're following us," she said, her voice tight. "A syndicate ship, and Tiva's with them." Theo cursed, his hands tightening on the controls. The smuggler's ship was fast, but it was old, and the syndicate's sleek cruisers were built for pursuit. He glanced at Nara, her face set with determination, and an idea struck him, one so crazy it might just work. "The asteroid belt," he said, pointing to a dense field of debris on the sensors. "If we can lose them in there, we might have a chance." Nara's eyes lit up, a mix of fear and excitement. "You're insane," she said, but there was admiration in her voice. "Let's do it." The ship dove into the asteroid belt, weaving through massive chunks of rock and ice, the syndicate cruiser hot on their tail. Theo's hands moved with a precision he didn't know he had, guided by instinct and Nara's steady presence beside him. She called out warnings, her voice calm but urgent, and together they navigated the deadly maze, the ship shuddering with each near miss. The syndicate ship fired, its blasts illuminating the belt in bursts of light, but the debris worked in Theo's favor, absorbing the shots. He pushed the ship to its limits, banking and diving until, finally, the cruiser miscalculated, clipping an asteroid and spinning out of control. Theo didn't wait to see if it recovered. He gunned the engines, breaking free of the belt and into open space. Silence settled over the cockpit, broken only by the hum of the engines and their ragged breathing. Theo glanced at Nara, her white hair disheveled, her jade skin glistening with sweat, and felt a surge of something deeper than relief. They'd made it, against all odds. They'd survived. "We did it," Nara said, her voice soft but filled with wonder. She turned to him, her eyes shining, and before he could speak, she leaned in, her lips finding his in a kiss that was fierce and tender all at once. It was different from the cockpit, less desperate system. I noticed that the response was cut off mid-sentence. "Let me complete Part 8 for you, ensuring it flows smoothly from Part 7, maintains the style of a satisfying and cohesive story ending, and adheres to the requirement of avoiding unreasonable breaks in the narrative." The silence in the cockpit was electric, charged with the weight of their escape and the unspoken promise between them. Theo's lips still tingled from Nora's kiss, her taste lingering like a spark that refused to fade. He wanted to pull her close, to lose himself in the warmth of her jade-green skin, but the vastness of space stretched out before them, a reminder that their journey wasn't over. Not yet. The syndicate ship was gone, lost in the chaos of the asteroid belt. But Theo knew better than to think they were safe. The key in Nara's blood, whatever it was, made her a target, and Tiva's cold determination haunted him. Still, as he met Nara's gaze, her eyes glowing with trust and something deeper, he felt a certainty settle in his chest. They'd face whatever came next together. "We did it," Nara repeated, her voice softer now, almost reverent. She leaned closer, her hand finding his, her fingers weaving through his with a familiarity that made his heart skip. "You got us out, Theo. You kept your promise," he chuckled, the sound rough with emotion. "Told you I'd get you out of that alley," he said, his grin teasing but warm. "Though I didn't sign up for monsters, evil sisters, and space chases." Her laugh was bright, a melody that filled the cockpit and eased the tension in his shoulders. "You handled it well, hero," she said, her voice playful but laced with gratitude. She shifted closer, her body brushing against his in the cramped pilot's chair. And for a moment, the stars outside faded, the universe narrowing to just the two of them. But the moment was fleeting. Theo turned back to the console, his fingers hovering over the controls as he plotted their next move. The smuggler's ship was holding, for now, but it was a patchwork of repairs and hope, and they needed a destination. "We can't go back to Zarathia," he said, his tone serious again. "The syndicate will be waiting, and Tiva—" He trailed off, glancing at Nara, the weight of her sister's betrayal hanging between them. Nara's expression darkened, but only for a moment. "Tiva made her choice," she said, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "She's not my family anymore. You are." The words hit Theo like a wave, stirring something raw and unshakable. He squeezed her hand, his thumb brushing over her smooth jade skin, and nodded. "Then we find somewhere new," he said. "Somewhere they can't touch us." He pulled up the star chart, his mind racing through options. The outer rims were lawless, but that made them dangerous. Too many eyes, too many bounties. Then he remembered a rumor, a whisper from his scavenging days. Oralis, a hidden planet in the Velquar system, a haven for runaways and outcasts, shielded by nebulous storms that made it nearly impossible to track. It was a long shot, but so was everything they'd done so far. "Oralis," he said, pointing to a faint blip on the chart. "It's off the grid, hard to find. If we can make it there, we could disappear." Nara studied the chart, her ears twitching slightly as she considered it. "Sounds like our kind of place," she said, her smile returning, a spark of adventure in her eyes. "Let's go." Theo set the course, the ship's engines humming as they accelerated toward the nebula. The journey wouldn't be easy, fuel was low, and the syndicate could still be out there. But the promise of Oralis, of a fresh start, fueled his determination. Nara stayed close, her presence a steady warmth as they worked together, monitoring sensors and tweaking the ship's systems to keep it running. Her confidence in him, her trust, was a lifeline, and he found himself stealing glances at her, marveling at how quickly she'd become his world. Hours passed, the stars blurring into streaks as they pushed deeper into the Velquar system. The nebulous storms loomed ahead, their swirling colors a beautiful, dangerous barrier. Theo's hands were steady on the controls, but his heart raced as Nara leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. Her scent, wild and electric, filled the cockpit, and he felt the pull of her, the memory of their kiss, a promise of more to come. "We're almost there," he said, his voice soft as the nebula's light bathed the cockpit in hues of violet and gold. "Just a little longer," Nara lifted her head, her eyes meeting his, and she smiled, a smile that held all the fire and tenderness he'd come to crave. "I'm not worried," she said, her voice a gentle caress. "Not with you." The ship shuddered as they entered the nebula, the storms buffeting them, but Theo held the course, Nara's hand on his arm a steady reminder of why he was fighting. The sensors pinged, detecting Oralis's faint signal, and Theo's heart leaped. They were close, so close to freedom. As they broke through the nebula, Oralis appeared, a vibrant planet of lush forests and shimmering seas, its skies clear and welcoming. Theo landed the ship in a secluded clearing, the engines powering down with a final, grateful sigh. The air outside was warm, fragrant with alien blooms, and as they stepped onto the soft ground, Nara's hand found his again, her touch grounding him. They stood together, looking out at the untouched world, the stars above them a canvas of endless possibilities. Theo turned to her, his heart full, and pulled her close, her body fitting against his like it was meant to be there. "We made it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Nara looked up at him, her eyes glistening, her lips curving into a smile that felt like home. "We did," she said, and then she kissed him, slow and deep, a kiss that spoke of survival, trust, and a future they'd build together. The weight of Zarathia, the syndicate, and Tiva fell away, replaced by the warmth of her embrace, the promise of a life beyond the stars. As they pulled back, Nara's laugh rang out, bright and free, and Theo joined her, the sound echoing through the clearing. They were runaways, outcasts, but they were together, and that was enough. Oralis stretched out before them, a new beginning, and as Theo held her close, he knew that whatever came next, whatever dangers or dreams awaited, they'd face it side by side, their bond stronger than any force in the universe.